Hi everyone. Welcome to CSCI 100, lecture 15. In this lecture, we're going to be talking about exceptions, which you actually already are familiar with. We'll just kind of formalize their name. We'll talk about testing, and you're going to learn about what unit tests are and what integration tests are, and how to approach testing your own code to make sure that it's working correctly. And finally, we'll talk about assert statements, which are it's a new construct in Python that you can use to write tests for your own code. Now we'll start with exceptions today. So sometimes it happens, your function or your program overall runs into an error. We've seen these errors all the time. When you had print a string plus an integer, you would get this can only concatenate string, not int to string. Notice say type error here. It would say type error. Or sometimes you'd be missing a parenthesis or missing a quotation. You'll get a syntax error. That'll say unexpected end of file while parsing, or some other error like that. Maybe you'll get an index error. If you try to index into a list, that's too short for that particular index. These errors in Python are formally called exceptions. It's called an exception. And Python will throw these exceptions when it encounters a problem it can't continue through. So the most common problem, like shown up here, I would say at least the earliest problem you can encounter is a syntax error. And so that's actually a problem for the compiler. When the compiler tries to translate your code into bits and bytes, into binary language for the computer, if it's not able to actually parse your code because you didn't follow the right syntax, then it can't actually finish producing something in binary to give to the computer. And so in kind of other languages that have a separate compiling and a separate running stage, we call a syntax error a compile time error. Whereas other errors like this one here, like you have a list of numbers, nums 1, 2, 3, and you try to index to get the index number 5 out of nums. Well, there's only 3 numbers here, so the highest index is 2. And so if you run this code, you'll get an error that says index error, list index out of range. And we'll refer to this kind of error as a runtime error because your code compiles, it's valid. There is a representation for it in binary, but when you actually run the code, when the computer executes the binary language code, it'll spit out an error. Now, I'm using this word here, by the way, throwing an exception. That's the terminology that we use when we talk about errors being shown to the user. And when this exception is thrown, when any exception is thrown, Python stops the program. It prints the error type and error message. So right here is our error type, index error, and right here is our error message, list index out of range. And it'll also print something called a traceback. More commonly, you'll hear people talk about these as a stack trace. So in Python, it'll actually say traceback, and then it'll show you kind of what line of code, or in the future, if you have like a function call, it'll show you, okay, where is this function called? And then the error in that function. So you can trace through your logic and figure out what kind of input caused the error. But we've seen this lots. It'll say the file name, the line number, where the error occurred. Now, this whole time, you've only seen these exceptions when there's some mistake in your code and you run your code. You've never meant to throw an exception, or to throw an exception. But it turns out you actually can raise your own exception. Obviously, you can't raise a syntax error because that kind of an exception is just for when you have an error in your code that makes it so the code can't even compile to binary. So you wouldn't ever reach a situation where you would have a syntax error while your code is already running. But in your logic, you can use this raise keyword followed by a space, then a type of error, a value error, and in parentheses, a string, which is the error message. And you can use this to raise your own error to cause this same kind of situation to happen. Why would you ever do this? Well, sometimes if you have a function that makes some assumptions about the input, if those assumptions are violated, you don't know what else to do. And so the best thing you can do is raise an error to tell the user to print out to the terminal that something was wrong. There's lots of these different types of errors, by the way. I show a value error here. If I pull up the full list, there are all of these. There's assertion errors, attribute errors, import errors, index errors, key errors, and you'll experience a bunch of these. Name error, runtime error, etc., etc., etc. But the most common one that you'll probably be typing on your own is a value error. Let's see one of these in action. Whoops. In this case, we have an introduce function. Oops. And I meant for this to look a little bit more like this. Yes. So in this case, we have an introduce function that we came up with way earlier on when we first learned about functions that takes a name and an age, and it prints out this is name and they are age. But one maybe assumption about an age is that you wouldn't expect an age to be negative. That's not possible. And in this case, nothing bad would actually happen if you passed in a negative age. You would just print out they are, -5 or whatever the number is. But maybe you want to make sure that the ages you're printing actually make sense. And so we can raise an exception in this introduce function if the age is not valid. So for that, we use a conditional. And our condition here is if the age is less than 0, colon. So if the age is less than 0, we will raise a value error. So we're using this keyword, the raise keyword, space, then the type of error, which here we're going to raise a value error, and our error message will be age cannot be negative. So we can see what happens if we run this. If I were to run this with, let me just take this over actually into Replit and show you. Yes, so I have my error here. If I first run this with introduce Alex 30, 3 main.py. Take a second before I run this and predict what will get printed to the screen, what will happen. So the string name is Alex. The age parameter here gets given the value 30 because it's passed in as the second argument. So when I run this code, it prints, this is Alex and they are 30. This is Alex and they are 30. So that's fine. This condition didn't get triggered. But what if we pass in an invalid age, like -4? That's not a valid age. And so if we run this code, it actually raises an error. It'll say value error, age cannot be negative. And we can look at our trace back here, or more commonly called the stack trace. And you can see it gives in order at the top where the function was called, introduce Alex -4 on line 6. And then within the function, in the introduce function, it says right here, in line 3, we raise this value error. So in line 3, we raise the value error. So that's all working as intended. Just, whoops, update that for our slides. That's exactly what I'm showing here.